Thank you for inviting me, Chungman, and for the church here. I should switch on my technology first of all.
And I will switch on mine as well.
Okay.
You can use this.
Great, thank you. I've got three things to control, so I'm going to get confused. So just tell you a little bit about myself. I was a missionary in Uganda until 18 months ago, teaching in a Bible college. Before that, I was a pastor in the UK for 10 years. Before that, I was a teacher. I'm studying for a PhD on the works of Francis Schaeffer at the University of Durham, and that is partly why I'm interested in these kind of things. But also, when I go back 20 years, I was trained to be a teacher, and I remember being in a kind of discussion with all of my fellow postgraduate students who were kind of in their 30s and 40s, a lot older than I was in those days, and we were discussing ethical issues, abortion and homosexuality and marriage and various things, and disciplining children, kind of icebreaker subjects. And I remember sitting there and thinking, I was a kind of fairly new Christian. I'd been a Christian for about 5 years. It suddenly dawned on me that they were thinking out of a completely different framework to me. The whole of their belief system was different to mine. And I think on that day I realized that if I was ever going to communicate the gospel to them, I had to begin where they were and build from them, where they were thinking. And I think that set me on a journey, which is where I'm kind of today, where for the last 18 months, I kind of do, at the moment I'm doing some kind of itinerant ministry. A friend of mine said to me, you can't call yourself an itinerant ministry, because he was also an itinerant ministry, had an itinerant ministry. And somebody wrote to him and said, "Dear illiterate minister," was confused two words. He said, people don't know what an itinerant minister is anymore, so he calls himself a travelling preacher now. But I'm a travelling preacher at the moment. To do a lot of travelling around the country, teaching these kind of things. And I'm also writing my PhD and raising my children. But we're hoping to go to Thailand later on this year. I plan to teach in a Bible college and to work in a school training the older children as they prepare to go back into Western society to face a barrage of the kind of ideas that I'm going to talk about this morning and how we handle them. So that's really kind of my journey. It began on that day when I thought, wow, these people have a different worldview than I have. And we're from two planets. And how do I communicate with these people? And I'm constantly trying to think about how do we communicate with people who are outside of the church today. So my kind of thing today, let me show you, I've got a plan. You should know I've got a plan. So my first session is mission in a crumbling culture. First of all, what do we mean by crumbling? That was the topic I was given at another place where I taught I was teaching these things at the Evangelical Movement of Wales Ministers Gathering, and they gave me that title, so I've kept it on. Mission in a crumbling culture. Secondly, this transition from modernity to post-modernity, nothing complicated about that when we talk about it. Thirdly, I think we're in a new era for evangelism as Christians. And fourthly, how do we understand the worldview of today? That's kind of where I'm trying to go. And then that's my first session. And then my second session, I've entitled Giving a Word Back, or what do we do today as Christians? How do we cope with the kind of world that we find ourselves in? So I'm thinking about context. If you go to a mission college and you're going to work in a Muslim country, they teach you lots about how you engage with Muslims. If you go to a Buddhist country, they talk to you about how you engage with Buddhists. We haven't thought enough in the West about how do we engage with our culture in this context that we find ourselves in. And it's changed dramatically, as Chungman suggested, over the last 30 years. I'm going to talk to you about that in a few minutes. How do we bring the gospel into the context? The gospel is unchanging, but the context has changed significantly. My parents do not think like young people that I interact with in the church in Liverpool every day. They think so differently about the world. The world has changed radically. So I want to help us do some discernment. This is about discernment. It's about thinking for Christ as well as singing for him. It's about the renewal of our minds. I often say that if we're not thinking, somebody else is thinking for us. And that's why we need to think biblically, and we have to think scripturally. Because if we're not, then somebody else has captured us with their own ideas. That's why to be clear thinkers for Christ is so important. And then the second reason I want to do this, as well as helping us with discernment, is that we might do mission better in this country. I think we do live in a crumbling culture. And how do we do mission better in a world that desperately needs to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ so desperately? We need to be better witnesses for Jesus, and we need to be better evangelists. But my first heading is, what do you mean by crumbling? I want to defend, first of all, the idea that we do live in a crumbling society. Because I think what you and I have to recognise is that in many contexts today, the very idea that our culture is crumbling will be strongly challenged. In fact, for many people, it's exactly the opposite. What is happening in our culture, and what's happened over the last 30 years, is that we've liberated ourselves from the shackles of a previous culture that needed to be discarded. Perhaps we might call that a Judeo-Christian culture. So we as Christians might see this kind of tsunami of immorality in our land, which is kind of coming over us. But for people who call themselves progressive, maybe social liberals type kind of people, they look out at the world and they say our world is much more moral than it ever was. So what might be poison for us can be meat for others. Or in a world increasingly of vegans, vegetables for other people. So we might wring our hands over the state of the world, but if you read the Guardian newspaper, the kind of things that I'm going to talk about this morning, which I see as evidences of a crumbling society, are actually celebrated. So I think it's worth spending just a few minutes on this, because if we're trying to reach young people today, thinking about how the young generation think, millennial people, how do we need to think about where they're up to often in their thinking. I'm obviously painting in big brushstrokes. But I think for many young people today, they've kind of bought into a story. And it goes like this, that this nation, when it derived its morality from Christianity or from the Bible in the past, then all sorts of things happened that we in our progressive and enlightened and tolerant society have now rejected. So in the past, witches were hunted, this is what we would say. Witches were hunted, gay people were imprisoned, single mothers were stigmatized, women were denied the vote, people were trapped in loveless marriages because they couldn't divorce. You had slavery and colonialism. The environment was polluted and wrecked by aggressive capitalism and so on. But now, thankfully, we've progressed into a more humanistic society. And as we have done so, the world has become a much more moral place. And we might call this, some people would call this the tolerance agenda. We're just much more tolerant than we used to be. So no longer do we condemn a person for their sexual preferences. And no longer do we censor a couple for having a child out of wedlock. No longer do we insist that a woman keeps a baby when to do so would adversely affect her career. So we've embraced the right of a woman to have an abortion. No longer do we define human sexuality so narrowly just between a man and a woman. We've embraced the idea of marriage equality so that same-sex couples can enjoy the benefits of marriage as well. I'm just thinking how people think. I'm not defending any of this, but how people think today. So no longer do we try to convert people to our religion. So today we live and let live. We recognise that there were different strokes for different folks. We tolerate every lifestyle choice as equally valid for the person who makes it. No longer do we hang criminals. No longer do we smack our children. Instead, we've turned our backs on the notion that you resolve struggles using your problems, using violence. So now we believe in negotiation, understanding, and therapy. No longer do we believe that our nation is best and fight wars to prove who is the best nation. No longer are we xenophobes and nationalists. Instead, we've embraced an internationalism, or at least a European identity. I'm not going to go there. But we're part of one world where we celebrate diversity and difference. And people would say no longer is the world run by WASPs, which stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who built a society to serve their power and their privilege. Now we've embraced diversity, people of colour, women, gay people. Everybody's included in this new inclusive society. You see, what I'm trying to show you is that for many people who are living today, it's not that we've actually lost our morality lost our morality as a nation. Actually, morality is alive and well with our love, peace and tolerance creed. We are more moral than we ever used to be. And for the kind of people who believe this narrative of the world, those who believe the Bible are the enemies. They need to be faced down and rebutted because they're wrong about how the world should be. You know, when I talk to people about religion, and people would include what we believe under the kind of banner of religion, there is this idea that religion divides the world and people from one another. It's the enemy of an open and a tolerant society. It refuses to respect other creeds and seeks to convert everybody to its way of thinking. It's a kind of demolition job. A juggernaut that comes along and tries to sweep everybody away under this banner of religion. And people who believe in God are dangerous. They do dangerous things like fly aeroplanes into buildings. And now, I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that this kind of narrative has won the hearts of the vast majority of young people in our land. If you go to a university in Britain and you talk to young people, to students, this is the kind of thing that you get as standard fare from what many, many young people believe in the UK and right across the Western world. This idea of let's love one another, let's accept each other's differences. Some people are gay, some people are transgender. Families come in all shapes and sizes. Don't judge anybody, just love people, accept them. Reality is fluid and open to a million possibilities. Let's enjoy whatever floats your boat and live for the moment and enjoy life. So what I'm suggesting to you that today the main reason why many people reject Christianity is not because of disbelief at the virgin birth, which I think it probably was when I was a child, and I'm not that old. But if you go back 60 years, people had this kind of thing that miracles just couldn't happen. So the virgin birth was impossible, the resurrection was impossible. But now the objection to Christianity is largely not along those lines. It's the idea that Christianity is a toxic creed. And far from having a crumbling society, actually we've got a far more progressive and better society, a more moral society than we used to have. So this is not crumbling, this is liberation. I was... not very long ago, I was watching Philip Schofield on ITV, and he was interviewing Andrea Williams, I think she's from Christian Concern, that's right. And she was explaining what she believed, and he said to her, your ideas are just medieval. He kind of sneered at her. That's a very common thing, isn't it? Sort of medieval ideas. So I've got a slide here for you. On the day that America, 2015, voted for same-sex marriage, the Supreme Court agreed to have same-sex marriage on the grounds of being against discrimination or for inclusiveness, whatever the grounds were, the legal grounds were. Hillary Clinton, that was her Twitter feed. And so you can see the rainbow colours. History is moving forward. This is progress. You see that? That's a very kind of graphic way that people think about things today. Now, what I'm not going to do this morning particularly is to engage with all of that narrative, because there's a lot to think about, and it needs a very significant response. But the point is that you and I need to be aware of all of that, the stuff I've talked about, that kind of progressive creed. When you come to London, I arrived in London yesterday. I came from Liverpool. It's only 2 hours on the train. Don't really know why we buy a building HST. Don't think we need it really. I fell asleep and woke up and I was in London. And I was in Bangkok 4 weeks ago. I think I got more culture shock arriving in London than I did in Bangkok. But in London, you can smell the progressive agenda in the air. It's everywhere, isn't it? But just to kind of leave that hanging there for you to think about. We must think about that. If you want to talk to young people today, you have to think about that kind of agenda. So what I want to do is to shift 180 degrees, and I want to put on my Christian lenses now and look at the world as a Christian. Because I don't agree with most of that agenda. Not all of it. Some of it I do, but not all of it. And I want to make a case that our society is lost and it is crumbling. And give you some reasons why I think that our society is in a crumbling state. And first of all, as a Christian, I would say, what are the things that identify our society as crumbling? Well, first of all, the Word of God is rare in our land. The Word of God is rare in our land. That's decay, if there ever was decay from where I'm standing. There is very little sense of God's power in the churches. You know, when I was a child, my parents were involved in a church in Manchester, and we saw dozens of people come to Christ in a very short space of time. And there was such power in the church. The presence of God was so real and powerful. People used to either come in and they would fall down on their face and repent of their sins and get right with God and be converted, or they would run out the door in the presence of a holy God. The power of God was present. It wasn't everywhere, but there was a time of the power of God being so significant. It so affected me that I don't think I ever doubted the existence of God, having encountered him in such powerful ways. And I don't sense that today. The power of God is not largely present in our churches. These are indicators of decay. Also, Christian thinking is not shaping our institutions in this land. It's just not. It's not shaping anybody. You think about the 4 hinge points of the Christian gospel: creation, fall, redemption, reformation. They're the hinge points of the gospel, aren't they? Creation, that God has made the world, he's the creator. Fall, there's something wrong with the world. We call it sin. There's a disease in our hearts that's wrecked the world. Redemption through Christ and his cross and resurrection. And then the consummation of history. These things, which should be the kind of linchpins of all of our lives, are virtually irrelevant for the vast majority of people in the United Kingdom. But that's decay. There is no fear of God in our land. There is no fear of God. I don't watch much television. I can't stomach much of that's on television these days. But I try to watch some television just to get a feel of how the culture's ticking, the kind of pulse of the culture. The way that people think and talk is so profane. There's a depravity that just comes out of people's mouths. There's no fear of God. And we misuse our Lord's name without limit, don't we, all the time? So let me just give you a few indicators as to why I think we live in a crumbling society. The first one is that children seem to be increasingly raised without any discipline. And that's a real indicator, or discipline, or character, or virtues, or values. And I say that to you as an indicator of decay, because if you don't know what you're handing on to your children in terms of what's a good society or a good person to be, there's something really seriously wrong. If you just let your kids be whatever they want to be and you're not trying to shape them to be anything, you don't know what the world's about. Does that make sense? It's incredible how we allow, in our day and age, our children just to absorb the culture through the media so uncritically, without talking to them, without helping them to think about it. And if you get the culture, you get the worldview. Because the culture is just the visible form of the invisible worldview. And Christian parents need to realise this. If you're saturated in the culture, if your kids are saturated in the culture, they will get the worldview that underpins the culture. And before long, they will be unbelievers. It's very important we think about that. But children raised with, I'm not talking about Christian parenting now, but it is something to think about. If you don't know what to pass on to your kids, there's something wrong. And then you think about, there is marital breakdown on an industrial scale. The breakdown of the family and of marriage is huge. And then the next one, which is connected, is the absence of fathers in the home. How many children are raised without a father? 50% in the UK? Maybe something like 50%. That is huge. And for children, especially from boys, without having a role model as a father, that's devastating. Because you learn how to live from having a parent that you can respect and you can follow in their footsteps. That's how you learn how to live, far more than you learn from reading books or whatever you get influence of. So fathers being absent is huge. These are just signs of decay. And then a collapse of masculinity and femininity. Every film's got some violent female character in it, hasn't it? I'm not dead against that, but what I am dead against is this idea that Men and women are interchangeable all the time. There's something deadly wrong about that. Because God has made men, men, and women, women, and we need to celebrate difference. And masculinity and femininity are something that's treasured. And when you trash it, you lose something really special. And we're doing it in our society. And of course, the whole notion of fluidity and everything in sexuality. The next thing is we live in this culture of rights and entitlement. This is a brownies badge I came across. And when you get your brownies badge, it says, raise your voice, know your rights. This is the brownies. I mean, the brownies, they were like, this was the ultimate place of duty and responsibility. Raise your voice, know your rights. A right is a rule that tells everyone how to treat you and what things you should be able to do. Everyone has them and everyone deserves them. Rights make our world fair and just. Who's the centre of the story? Well, you are. It's all about you, isn't it? So responsibilities and duties have kind of gone out the window. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the Bible is never about rights. It's about righteousness. One is a man-centered, human-centered worldview, and one is a God-centered worldview. And there's a huge difference. Huge difference. And then another indicator of a crumbling society is that we've got this epidemic of suicide, self-harm and depression. It is massive. Mental health issues. I've just been in Whitby, in North Yorkshire, preaching at Whitby Evangelical Church, and it's a very beautiful place. It's freezing cold, but it's a very beautiful place. And there are people who go out on the cliffs every single night on a rota on suicide watch. Because on average in North Yorkshire, 84 people jump off the cliffs to kill themselves every year. 84 people. Suicide is an epidemic, especially young men. People have lost hope. I'll talk about hope tomorrow. So you've got this epidemic, which is another indication of a crumbling society. The next is that there's a bit of a kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I'm fluent in 6 languages: profanity, music lyrics, music quotes, sarcasm, sexual innuendos, and real talk, whatever real talk is. But here's the point, that there is this sense of decay in people's speech and in popular culture. There is something beautiful about that you can I think you can define beauty. But if there's beauty, there's also degradation. And I think a lot of our culture is becoming cheap. In our entertainment, in our humour, in our music, in our drama, we celebrate the profanity, the base, the sordid. And people don't see it. And the reason they don't see it is because it's the air that they breathe. They've never seen the opposite. The next thing, so we've lost a sense of beauty and wholesomeness. That's number 7. Number 8 is cynicism. Is the kind of default position of our society. So I've put here a definition of cynicism, or some, what do you call them? Similes. Doubt, pessimism, distrust, suspicion, sarcasm, mistrust, bitterness, and so on, skepticism. These are, cynicism is this sense that you always see through things to the negative. You never accept anything at face value. You never see the wholesome. You always find that there's a suspicious motive behind everything. Now, part of that is encouraging, because we could say, well, people realize that people should be saying, well, there is sin in the world, that people's motives are not pure. But on the other hand, there's something very, very dangerous when we've lost our sense of being able to see the good in anything. Because cynicism is not the final word on the world. There is a lot of good in the world, because there's a good God behind the world. But if you trash everything in a cynical, sneering, scoffing way, it's a very, very awful world that you create. And we in Britain are probably the most cynical of any nation. Sometimes I go to other countries and I think, well, you seem quite naive about the world. And I realise I've come from a cynical land. But actually, it's not a good thing. We're cynics. So cynicism and suspicion rule the land. Number 9. This is you know about this. This is the Northern Ireland bakers who refused to bake a cake for a gay couple, homosexual couple, same-sex couple who wanted a cake iced to celebrate their marriage, so-called marriage. And I know in the end they won in the Supreme Court, which was amazing. Many people were praying. But when I dug this out, they'd lost the court cases up until then. But since then they have won. But one of my arguments for a decaying society is that at the heart of our society there is deceit. Because we believe that we're tolerant, but actually we are highly intolerant. We have never been more intolerant. We only tolerate a very narrow paradigm of the world that we are permitted to have. You go into a conversation with your liberal colleagues and say to them that there might be a time when a naughty child needs a smack, and see how much tolerance you get. Or say that children need their fathers and mothers. Or say that our values that are good in our society have come from the Bible. We have this idea today. We've moved from a society where we have freedom of conscience as the default position, where you're allowed to have freedom of conscience, to where everybody has the right not to be offended. And if somebody is offended, then they have a right to accuse you of a hate crime. And that's a completely different way of our society going on. But there's deceit at the heart of our society. We think we're tolerant. Actually, we're not tolerant. We are blinded by a whole misunderstanding of the world, and we don't even know it. What we've done is we've embraced one worldview and we say this is the tolerant worldview, but it excludes all others. We also think I got this from what's that free paper called? Metro. The Metro. £136 million jackpot tomorrow. This was a few years ago. Choosing an island is going to be tough. The point is that if you win this jackpot, you can buy an island. And there is this whole idea that what makes you happy is material possessions and achieving your ambitions. And people really believe it, despite all the evidence against it. Fame is the most likely thing to cause you to commit suicide, statistically. So again, fame is the most likely thing to cause you to commit suicide. Look at the amount of people who are famous who kill themselves. So fame and material possessions define the world for the way that people think. And then another sign of our decay is that we are ignorant of our roots in this country. We are ignorant of what our Christian roots have given us that have made our society what it is. I spent 6 years in Africa, and I saw the poor oppressed terribly, and the corruption of the government. And one day this man said to me, this dear African brother, he said, in my country there's only fear and power and fate. That's all there is. Fear and power and fate. Who rule the land. That's probably an exaggeration. But that was a man who was an African saying that to me. And, when I lived abroad, and I've lived abroad for 8 years of my life, I realized that there were things about this country that shaped this nation that would only have happened because people had their Bibles open when they were thinking about how to build a world. The rule of law. The value of all people regardless of their income or their status. Freedom of expression. And conscience. These things are not normal in the world. They come from somewhere. And our society is increasingly ignorant of those things. We don't talk about things, but just to give you a couple of examples of this. God defeated Satan, not on the basis of power, but on the basis of justice. And when people were formulating the Magna Carta, the whole notion of the beginnings of the rule of law, or I'm not sure the beginnings of the rule of law, but the codification of the rule of law, that was being talked about in our nation, that justice should be the basis of society, not power. That's huge, isn't it? Because in a society you have the rule of law, you have the rule of men, usually men, who rule the place. Or think about this. Think about the days of the kings, and you have Ahab in the Old Testament, and he wanted to take Naboth's vineyard. It might be a melon field or vineyard, because he wanted to expand his grounds. Is that right? He was married to Jezebel. She wasn't a Jew. She wasn't an Israelite. And he went to Naboth and said, "Could I have your land?" Naboth said no. So Jezebel said, "Goodness me, just take it. You're the king." But you know, in Israel, even the king was under the rule of law. Well, it's unheard of in the world. It's unheard of in lots of the world today. The king was under the rule of law. That idea got into people's thinking that everybody should be under the rule of law. That the rule of law was an absolute because there was a law of God above it. These things shaped our nation. And, you know, we've lost all sense of them. Os Guinness likens the West to a cut flower society. So when you get flowers from the garden, see some daffodils outside, you can cut them and put them on your table, and they last a certain amount of time. But they will die because they're cut off from their roots. And our society is dying because we are cut off from our roots. I'm not saying our society was perfect. We've got to account for slavery. We've got to account for colonialism. We've got to account for the treatment of women in many cases. But it was because we went back to the Bible and we applied the scriptures that slavery was abolished. Because we said all people are the same, equal before God, whether they're black or white. And that was the thrust of Wilberforce's argument. Because we went back to the Bible. So it wasn't because we were a Christian that we engaged in the slave trade. It was because we'd abandoned our Christianity that we pursued the slave trade. And it was the Bible that helped us, taught us that we should abolish it as a nation. So we're ignorant of much of our past. Other things. This is the age, I've called this the age of meology, where we're the centre of all things. And in the UK, we abort 200,000 babies a year. On the altar of ourselves, really, of our own pleasures and desires. Because we worship ourselves. You know, if you want to understand our land, you've got to understand what do we worship. We worship ourselves. And everything must be bent to accommodate our rights, our pleasures, our income, our holidays, and we're willing to sacrifice our babies on that altar. That's if you ever wanted an indication that our society is a crumbling society, it's that we kill our own offspring. If you talk to Muslims, they cannot believe it because they value children. So, crumbling society. This is, I don't know why I got that slide in. This is the age of meology. This is Hillary Clinton in her campaign with Trump. And nobody's looking at her. They all want a selfie with Hillary Clinton in the background with themselves. Isn't that interesting? Their focus is themselves. And then I was in Cambridge. And this was in 2016 when I came back from Uganda. And we saw this toilet. And my little girl, who was 5, Lydia, she said to me, "Daddy, who's that third character?" And then she said, "I think it's a lady in a skirt in the wind with the wind blowing her skirt to the side." You know, there are lots of things that we're not sure about, but the difference between a man and a woman is not one of them. And there are lots of things that we're not sure about, but the difference between a man and a woman is not one of them. And what we're seeing is a wave of insanity and mental illness sweeping the land, which is shaping our worldview. And that's highly dangerous. There are children who are being given medication at the age of 7 years old to change their gender, and they are being sterilized as a result. And we are allowing it to happen as a society. These are indicators of a society that is collectively losing its sanity. You know, mental health issues aren't just confined to individuals. You can have mental health issues for a whole society And that's what's happening in our land with issues like transgender. I don't doubt people struggle with these issues. That's not the issue. That's not the issue. But changing people's gender from being a man to a woman is not going to help them in the end. And even the BBC was willing to have a piece on their website about lots of men who transitioned to becoming women, supposedly, who wanted to go back. Well, it's amazing that the BBC even conceded to have that on their webpage. So that's how big an issue it is. And so anyway, lots of things we could say about that. So the transgender issue. So these are reasons for a crumbling society. All right. I think what we're witnessing now, I'm trying to help us understand the kind of times that we live in. That we're going through this period where the Enlightenment project is dying. You know, my grandfather was an old-fashioned atheist. And I used to talk to him about the gospel often. And he was, he'd fought in the First World War and seen terrible things. He came back from the First World War and he planted an orchard in his garden. He bought a house with a big piece of land and he planted this orchard. And it was after he died that I realised that orchard for him was therapy, because he'd seen such terrible things in the First World War. It was a way of trying to cope with these memories that he'd had. But he still believed in the perfectibility of human beings, that we could build a perfect utopian world. He believed that through science and through reason and through education and through technology, we could solve all the world's problems and have a utopia. That was the dream of the Enlightenment, of modernity, as it was called. And I think what's happening now is not that we've passed into a postmodern world, which we kind of celebrate. I think what's actually happening is that we are witnessing the death of modernity. This is the death of a society, because science can't fix all of our problems. In fact, it's got no basis unless you believe that there is an ordered and a structured universe that's been created by God. It's very difficult to know how we can even do science. It's very difficult to have reason unless you believe that there's rationality behind the universe. I mean, why trust your brain if it's just a monkey brain that's evolved? Why trust it? So what's happened now is that modernity is kind of dying, because the basis of modernity there's nothing solid about it. And we've got this kind of situation where we've got decay. All right, so I think we are in a new era for evangelism. Martin Lloyd-Jones. Do you all know Martin Lloyd-Jones? He was the minister of Westminster Chapel, 1898 to 1981 were his years. And he was really kind of forward in his thinking, was Lloyd-Jones, because he recognised that he was living through a time of enormous cultural change. And he used this illustration in 1957 to make a point. He said that in the early days of his ministry, so back in the 1930s and 1940s, he said evangelism was like going along a country lane, and it's getting dark and it's night time, and you find a man asleep under a hedge. And you notice that there's a storm coming, lots of rain. So just out of sheer kindness, you realise that this won't be a safe place for him to spend the night. So you go up to him and you wake him up. And he's grateful, and he goes on his way to a place of safety. And Martin Lloyd-Jones said that when he was a young minister in South Wales, that's all he had to do. He just had to run a campaign, and it would wake people up to their need for salvation. And he saw many people converted, maybe 1,000 people in his first pastorate in South Wales. He said what he was doing was he was waking people up to their sense of godness in their conscience, that they had some knowledge of the gospel that had been implanted in them. And you had to wake them up to it and remind them to repent and come to Christ. And they did. But he said that by the 1960s, that you found a man under the hedge and a storm was coming, and you couldn't wake him up. And the reason was, this was his language, was that he had poison in his system. and he was drugged. And you couldn't shake him out of it. And he said, the devil has not only caused people to fall asleep, but the whole world has been drugged and is in the arms of the wicked one, in the hands of the wicked one. So he said, that kind of old Billy Graham 1950s evangelism, where you had a campaign, that kind of thing didn't work anymore because people just didn't come to be woken up. You had to extract the poison from people first before you could even communicate the gospel with them. And I think that's right. People don't have a memory of Christian ideas. It's very difficult to stir people in their consciences to what they instinctively believe to be true because they don't believe it to be true anymore, the gospel. I remember when I was a teacher in Kenya, and there was an elderly lady who was a PE teacher from Blackpool who was teaching PE and swimming in the school. And we had a discussion about, as a teaching staff, as to whether the children in the school should ever be allowed to go in the staff room to put their homework on somebody's desk, that kind of discussion, you know. And this lady said, lady from Blackpool, she said, in all the schools I've ever taught at, the staff room is the holy of holies. No children ever go in there. And at the end I said to her, how do you know about the holy of holies? And she said, I did A-level scripture. And I thought, how many people today would have any idea about the holy of holies? How many people have done A-level scripture? Well, this lady wasn't a believer. But you see, what we have today is people drugged with this idea that Christianity is toxic. The message of Scripture is death, it's not life. We have a people who will not hear the gospel because they're drugged. And this is something to think about, that the West is a mission field of a type we've not really seen before. It's made up of people who think that Christianity has been tried in the past and found wanting. So it's not an unreached mission field. You know, in some ways, unreached mission fields are much easier. If you go to find an unreached tribe in Indonesia, I think you'd find gospel work much easier than you would find on the streets of Hayes. Because this is a society that believes that our country has tried something and it was found to be a failure. Christianity. You know, when I was in Uganda, you can talk to anybody about the gospel anywhere and they listen to you. Anybody. It's so easy. You just go to a shop, talk about the gospel, talk about Christ. They listen to you. There's no embarrassment. There's no shuffling, and there's no attempt to evade the issue or rebuke you for being some bigot, whatever it is. And when I came back, I realized just the incredible contrast to get a hearing for the gospel. So, you know, sometimes when I talk about these things, people say, well, we need revival. And we do need revival. We should pray for revival. But I think as well, we also need to think about how we engage with people and we understand where people are coming from, and we start where they are, not over here, which so often is what Christians do. We start in a place where they are not. We have to start where they are. Right, in a minute we'll discuss some questions, have some questions, but let me tell you a few. My next heading is Understanding Today's Worldview. So how do we understand the times that we live in? That's my heading, my next heading. How do we get a grip on how people think today in a kind of nutshell? How do we reduce the oak tree to an acorn in a definition? Now, you know, we could try to identify how our society thinks theologically. I could talk to you in terms of suppressing the truth of God. I could talk to you in terms of being made in God's image and rejecting that knowledge. I could talk to you in terms of sin. We could do that. I'm not going to do that because you hear that probably a lot of the time. But how do we define it kind of non-theologically today? Well, I think this is the age of aggressive individualism. Aggressive individualism. This is the age of the exaltation of the self. The individual is the central player in your story. Remember, in postmodernism, there are no big narratives that you follow. There's just you in the world. And you define the world for yourself. You decide what truth is for you, and you pursue it, pursuing your own goals. That's aggressive individualism. There is a story that you write for your life. And everybody has the right to write their own story on their own terms. And the worst thing you can do is to comment on somebody else's story, because it's theirs. You're the centre of all things. We don't even challenge that or question that, most people in our society. So it's in that kind of way of thinking, who is a hero? This is, if you think about who does the BBC think is a hero? You can tell a lot about society by who are the heroes. And according to the BBC, heroes are people who defy the odds. So a woman who becomes a boxer, because she goes against the stereotypes that it's only a man's role. Or a girl who's, 13, 14, who's an environmental campaigner, who you'd expect to be at school working, but because the world is in such a terrible place, she gets international attention to be a child lecturing the world on how we should all change our environmental habits. She's a hero. Anybody who breaks the mould defies the expectations of their family, if they're a Muslim, or goes against traditional gender roles. That's what it means to be heroic, because this is the age of the individual with their own story, their aggressive individualism. So, in some cultures, it's heroic to fit in with your group and serve the group and maintain its value system. In our society, we despise that. It's heroic to go against your culture and your group and to be different. There's no reason why it should be that way. That's just the way that we've been brainwashed over the centuries. The next thing to say, so that's aggressive individualism. How we understand the culture is that Tim Keller says that our society is being catechized into believing certain things. Do you know what a catechism is? I teach my children a catechism. To give them a kind of roadmap for theology. I have to bribe them with chocolate to do it. So it starts off, these are some questions. Who is the true God? The true God is the infinite and personal God. That's Schaeffer's. The true God is the infinite personal God. Who made God? Nobody did. They have to learn these answers. Has God ever had a beginning? No, God has always been. This is a catechism. Will God ever die? No, God lives forever. Who made you? God made me. Can God do all things? Yes, God can. Can God do all things? God can do all his holy will. What can't God do? God can't sin, lie, or die, or deny himself, and so on. So they have to learn this catechism. But our society has never learned a catechism, but it's been catechized. So who or what is central to all reality? Well, you are. And that's the answer to the first catechism question. What or who is central to all of reality? What is truth? Number 2, what is truth? Well, truth is what's true for you. Truth is constructed according to your preferences and your rights. Number 3, who gets to tell you what is right and wrong? Well, no one does. No one has got the right to tell me what's right and wrong. As long as I don't hurt anybody else, I can do what I want, and I'm only accountable to myself. Number 4, what's the principle of happiness? Well, you've got to be true to yourself. You've got to do what makes you happy. The whole of Disney teaches you that, all the Disney films. I have friends who won't let their children read Harry Potter. And you can make a case for that, because it's full of witches and wizards. But they let their children watch all the Disney films, which are saturated in a worldview which is just much more subtle to work out. Always follow your heart. Your heart will never lie to you. Do what makes you happy. Pursue your dreams. Well, the Bible tells me that my heart is desperately sinful and wicked. I shouldn't follow what it says to me. And you see the shallowness that sometimes we go about the world as Christians. What is the embedded worldview we don't see? We don't dig deep enough to understand these things. So, number 5. Where does human value come from and self-worth? This is my 5th catechism question for our society. Where does human value and self-worth comes from? Well, I think human value and worth comes from self-expression. That's where you get your value from. That's what the media tells us. You express yourself in your career or in your fame or in your blog. You express yourself. That's where your value comes from. It's good to always step back from our culture. And, I think often people should get out of this nation and go and see other countries and then come back. But I remember talking to my Ugandan students. I taught in this Bible college. And they were just coming to terms with the fact that in the West, same-sex marriage was becoming normal. They found that very hard to believe that a man could marry a man. And then I told them that men were transitioning to become women. And they looked very, very puzzled. And this guy who was very thoughtful, they thought for a moment and he said, you people in the West, you've got so much time on your hands to think about silly things. He said, we in Uganda, we're just trying to survive the day. Isn't that interesting? But I tried to get them to understand the culture in the West. And I used to say to them, there are two things, because they knew their Bibles. There were two things that got traction with their thinking. Number one was to say that when Jesus was before Pilate, and Jesus said, what did Jesus say? I'm the truth. What did Jesus say to Pilate about the truth? I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. And Pilate says, what is truth? And Pilate's been called the first postmodernist. Cynical about truth. And the second thing that got traction with them, to help them to understand, was when I used to go to the book of Judges. What's the refraining thing in Judges? Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And if you get those two pieces of understanding about where the West is, you understand the culture. Cynicism about truth. Everyone does what's right in their own eyes. Then you have this thing called I'm nearly finished. I'm going to stop in a second. I'm just trying to give us handles to understand the society. So I've given you a definition. What else did I give you? The catechized society. The next thing is identity politics. Identity politics is this idea that who you are, the group that you belong to, is the most important thing about you. So if you listen to discussions today, somebody will say, well, as a gay man, this is my opinion. Or as a woman of colour, this is my opinion. So what's actually happening in our society is that we have made gender, sexuality, homosexuality, and transgender the lenses that we look at the whole world through. And we've divided up everything into these different groups. And we weaponize them. And divided everything from everybody else. And some people in some people in certain groups are oppressors and some people are oppressed. Some people are persecutors and some people are victims. And our society has developed this whole way of giving different groups power. So think about the power of the gay lobby to claim victim status and to get what they want. It's absolutely huge. The power to forbid people to say certain things that you don't want them to say is huge, isn't it? So the group you belong to, if you're in an oppressed minority group, supposedly, you get enormous power. It's ironic. There's a book come out by Douglas Murray, which you should all read. Douglas Murray's written a book called The Madness of Crowds. It's a critique of identity politics. And it's incredibly perceptive. He says that if you look, he identifies himself as a gay man, but he's dead against identity politics, which kind of gives him some authority in certain circles. But Douglas Murray says that in the UK, gay couples and gay people earn more money than heterosexuals. And they're supposed to be victims, but they earn more money, which demonstrates the problem. They're not in a victim category. But he said, according to this kind of logic of identity politics, they must have got their privilege from oppressing somebody else, because that's how it always works. If you've got any privilege, it's because you've oppressed somebody. But actually they're better off. So what should happen according to their kind of logic is that those people, gay people, are taxed heavily to give money to heterosexuals. He's just trying to show the silliness of it all, you know. Understanding our culture. I need to make comment about this whole notion that we live today at a time of, we live after 75 years in the UK of peace and prosperity. Nobody's really had a war for 75 years in the UK. We've never faced any existential threats. Even when we get a minor one like the coronavirus, we really panic, don't we? How did people cope when there was the Blitz in London? But I once went into the Royal Armouries in Leeds. There's a big museum of warfare in Leeds. It's very depressing, actually, how we advance in our ability to kill people. But as you go in the door, it's gone now, but there was this notice, and it was a quote from a poet. And this person had said, "I used to think that war corrupts a nation, but now I've realised that peace can corrupt a nation as much as war can." And you know, peace and prosperity does something to you. And it does all sorts of things to you. It makes you soft and sentimental about the world. But it also gives you a sense, or it can give you a deep naivety about sin and evil. And that's another piece of the jigsaw that we have to understand, that we live in an age of incredible naivety about sin and evil. You know, peace and prosperity kind of causes you to forget the terrible things that human beings are capable of doing to other people. It's very difficult to teach the younger generation in our nation that they're sinners when you're the let's be cool generation, let's celebrate life together generation, let's be internationalists and we all love each other, that kind of generation. When Jesus came into the world to save sinners, the gospel is a very hard message to communicate to this generation. And then you think about this small matter of God himself. I don't know if you've talked to university students. If you talk to university students who are not believers, people used to put their hand up and say, "I can't believe in the virgin birth or the resurrection." Now, the first question that nearly always comes is this: why is it that God demands worship from his creatures? Has he got some kind of psychological disorder that he needs to be worshipped? If I demanded worship, there'd be something wrong with me. And this idea that we need God to forgive us, that we need God's forgiveness. I mean, look at the world that we live in today. God needs to be forgiven by us because he's left the world in this terrible state. Just look at the world that God has bequeathed to us. It's not that God is in, it's that, you know, God is now in our debt. It's not that we're in his, needing him to forgive us. We need him to forgive us. So can you see why Christianity is increasingly seen as this toxic creed for many people? And of course, it's not just in amongst unbelievers where you see this. You see this in the families of children from Christian homes. The research suggests that between 70 and 80% of young people who are raised in a Christian home lose their faith by the time they're 21. And I suggest to you that for many of them, they are captured by this kind of creed. It takes hold of them. It wins their hearts and minds. Tim Keller says that the idea that religion is bad is not a new thing. I mean, you go back to the atheists of the past, like Voltaire and other people who said religion is a bad thing. But Tim Keller says what is new today is that we should have respect for religion. Today we should despise religion. That's what the new atheists are saying. People used to think, I think even when I was a child, I was in a church meeting in primary school. We sang hymns every morning. We had prayers. And there was a sense amongst the teaching staff who were not believers that Christianity was like nutrition. It was good for you. It was like good nutrition. And I think that sense has largely gone. I was listening to Roger Carswell, the evangelist, and he was saying that he was talking to some medical students at Leeds University, postgraduate medical students, and they were all from the Arab world, and they were Christians. And this lady said, it's far harder to be a Christian in the UK than in Egypt. She said, in Egypt I might lose my life for being a Christian, but she said the pressure, there's three pressures, she said, in the UK, to be silent, secular and materialistic. Silent, secular and materialistic. So, that's all I want to say really. To kind of define where we are, and then after our coffee break, I'm going to talk about how do we respond to some of this? What do we do in this tsunami of unbelief and of godlessness, this toxic rejection of Christianity, this idea that Christianity is toxic, this poison in people's bloodstreams? What do we do? Do we just die as a church in this land? What do we do? So we're going to think about that later. Anyway, we've got a few minutes for questions, I think. Yes. So,
I thought,
yeah.
I could just ask questions. We got about 15 minutes before the coffee break, so feel free to ask any questions that might come in mind. I have one myself, just to kind of let ball rolling and so on, and give time to think. So, very helpful assessment of the changing times. I was wondering, in particular, you mentioned kind of you came from Liverpool kind of yesterday, and you came to London, and you felt that it was a even bigger change, culture shock than it was to going to Thailand a couple of weeks ago. So for us who are kind of in the suburbs of London, I guess kind of because we breathe the air, we might not notice things as much. The kind of the fish in the bowl, as it were. What were some of the things that you found shocking about coming to London? What are the things that we also should have in mind, especially as we engage with people who work in London, grew up in London, live in London, and so on? It's something that's, I always wondered, because it's perceived as a cultural hub, whether it's very different from other places in the UK. I haven't been outside Italy that much, but it becomes a blur for me. Or whether it's changing a bit more with it becoming more of a global village and so on with the internet.
How do you sense that?
Yeah, I mean, it may have been more of a kind of intuition. There's something I can reason about. But I think London is an international city, which is quite different to the rest of the UK in that it has a very internationalist outlook. The kind of internationalist, urban, metropolitan elite outlook is not just in London, it's in Berlin, it's in Paris, it's in probably, I don't know, maybe not so much in Tokyo, it's in New York, it's in Los Angeles. And I think it's this is tied into the kind of Brexit question, but there is something about the absence of a national identity and a kind of internationalist identity that's linked into multiculturalism. And these big urban centres are bastions of progressive thinking in terms of morality, sexuality. If you go to South Yorkshire or Lancashire, people would challenge transgenderism quite openly in your local pub. They probably wouldn't do that in Islington. And they would sing the national anthem, and you'd find people in the village who'd fought in the British Army and had a sense of allegiance to the British nation. You wouldn't find so many of them in Islington. I think there's less of us in London. There's less of a sense of Britishness than you'd get in other parts of the country. Now, I live in Liverpool, which is a little bit different. Liverpool's not like South Yorkshire or Lancashire. It's a very left-wing city, but it's not particularly multicultural. It's quite white. But it also hates Boris Johnson and Margaret Thatcher even more, going back. And it's more like old Labour, probably. In the days of Jim Callaghan and Claire Mackley.
These are things that you pick up because of your breadth of knowledge.
Yeah.
So what we're wanting, how did you sense what you sense? Maybe it's because you are aware of so many things that other people have just absorbed and therefore don't even think about.
I mean, I think if you probably read the Guardian newspaper, you get a strong sense of what makes a lot of people in London tick.
It's interesting that, for example, kind of within internationalism, for myself, growing up in the UK, I found it really difficult to identify myself, even when I became a British citizen, as a Brit. I still find it a bit awkward, but I found it easy to identify myself as a Londoner before I became a Christian. And it's something which I see in other friends with different backgrounds and so on. But for us, as we kind of engage with friends and colleagues who work or live in London, having those kind of backgrounds seems to be helpful.
Yes. I mean, I didn't mean that as a negative thing. I think these things are complex and have to be unpacked. But I do think London is quite different from other parts of the UK. Yeah, I'm sure there's good and bad, but I think that there's just a more extreme sense of a kind of relativistic culture, fluidity. You can't challenge the kind of progressive understanding of the world as easy as you could in other parts of the country. And again, that's been borne out, hasn't it, in the last election as well, considerably with arguably the kind of balance of power now resides with voters in the north of England who can determine which way the election goes. And that's been a bit of a shock, I think, to London, with the whole Brexit thing. So, yeah.
Any other questions? Rob?
You spoke a lot about when we engage with those who do not share the same worldview.
Yes.
That we're to start where they are.
Yep.
How do we do that without either inhabiting their world, i.e. living in it and absorbing it ourselves, or losing ground to where we actually want to bring them?
Well, I mean, it's where we are in our hearts that counts. So, where are we in terms of our, if our allegiance is to God and the Scriptures, that we don't have to worry too much about, so long as we are alert to the influences that the culture can have on us, we have to retain Christian fellowship, reading of the Scriptures, reading of Christian books, being part of the church family. We need to retain a strong anchor in the gospel and in God and who we are as believers, our identity being in Christ. We mustn't give that away. And I think that's possible to do. But I think that we have to be careful that we're not separatists. There are issues about children, for example, the age that children should be exposed to all of this stuff. That's a different issue because they're younger. But I think we shouldn't be separatists. So, we should be reading the newspapers, we should be watching the television to learn about the culture, and we should be talking to non-Christians. We should be listening to them. And how do we... So, and I don't think we have to give away who we are. I don't particularly want to migrate to becoming a secularist. I don't see any hope in our world. I see a lost world without Jesus. I don't think I want to be there and get to 75 and die, and that's the end of my existence. Because I see the emptiness and the hollowness of it. So I don't feel threatened by it. But I think we need to listen to people, and I think, when we engage with people, we have to recognize that for a lot of people, their thinking about Christianity is that they're thinking in that toxic paradigm. How do we question that for them? I mean, that's my next half. We do that.
That's the thing I love about Schaefer.
Yes.
He answers that question.
Yes, I mean, one of my headings is we have to answer people's questions. And, are we doing that well? I think we should answer people's questions. I mean, you see, one of the reactions that we can have is just to be hostile. And I've got a friend in the States, and he says a lot of people preach the holiness of God, not because they honour the holiness of God, it's just because they don't like people. And they're looking they're waiting for the whole world to go to hell so they can say, we've been vindicated, we're right. And there is some truth in that. And But Jonah, yes. In fact, I was preaching on Amos last week, and I thought the contrast between Amos, who prayed that God's judgment would roll back, would recede, And Jonah, I know that Amos was speaking to fellow Jews, and Jonah was speaking to Gentiles who threatened the Jewish people. I know that. But still, Amos is the man with the heart of the prophet. He loved the people.
Any other questions? Mark first.
Yeah.
Do you know, like, in terms of the driving force of where it's coming from, is it like the government, is it small lobby groups in terms of this culture that's come in of me, self, or is, like, is there a point of, like, a root of where it comes from in terms of, is it like from the top down, or is it coming through different groups?
Well, I think it started in Genesis 3 with the fall. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek. But I do think that all godless philosophies begin in the human heart of sin. That's worth saying, because we have this great desire in us to suppress the truth. Because the truth of God is everywhere. It's just that we don't look for it. I mean, it seems inconceivable to me that this world is not a created world, but we make it a decreated world, as Schaeffer says. We inhabit a world of reason, which points to a rational mind behind the universe. We can do science because the world is ordered and structured. Well, where does that come from? So, but we suppress that truth. So that's a theological point. But in terms of where this has come from, I mean, I think, there was the Enlightenment project, 300 years ago, and there was this attempt to build everything from man, not from God, and to glory to man in the highest, Alexander Pope said. And so I think since then, the Christian worldview lingered on, but it was you had the challenge of the Enlightenment project, and then it kind of mingled together, and the church failed to work out what was the gospel, what wasn't, and so got into all sorts of confusion. And so you got liberal Christianity, supposedly, and all that stuff that happened. But very recently, of course, you've had the... I think the West lost confidence in itself and in its Christian past. And I think it happened because there were 2 world wars with enormous slaughter, and then there was the Holocaust. And people thought, well, if European countries can do this, has our Christianity that we've had given us any benefit? And then the 1960s came, and young people grew up after the Second World War, the baby boomers, and they looked at their parents who had a bit of old-fashioned morality, but no basis for that morality, because they kind of lost their Christian roots, and they said, well, there's hypocrisy everywhere, and they kicked against it, and you had the 60s countercultural revolution, the hippie movement and all that, and they took the world to another point of saying, well, anything goes. And then that was all backed up by the postmodern philosophers. So people like Friedrich Nietzsche, of course, had a very big impact. But then later on, people like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. So Foucault said, everything is power in the world. You probably know this, but Foucault said that every single motivation is power. There is no truth. People just claim that they know the truth, and actually they're just trying to get one over you by controlling you, by saying you've got to obey my truth. And Foucault said that is the whole world. And that is really what people believe today. That's why people are cynical. That everything has to be... We need to look at the world through a hermeneutic, an interpretation of suspicion. Always be suspicious. That's what Foucault said. And then Jacques Derrida said there is no meaning in the text. There is no meaning in any text at all, apart from his own books, which he wrote. There's no meaning in text. There's only what you impute to it. And that's got into theology with a new hermeneutic, so that every culture looks at the Bible differently. And that's desperately dangerous. But so, Jacques Derrida was very, very influential. So these philosophers have had a massive impact. And then I think when the Blair government got into power in 1997, there was a sea change in the UK, because the children of the baby boomer children who'd grown up in the 60s and who'd never had any Christian morality from their home, they got into power. And I think they brought in all these postmodern assumptions, and very quickly homosexual men and women were allowed to adopt children, and there was hardly any comment about it or debate about it, whereas that wouldn't have been the case 20 years before. And I think Cameron, after Blair, thought, well, the only way that I can get votes is to buy into that liberal agenda. So you've got liberal conservatives like Osborne and Cameron and even Boris Johnson, I suppose now. And so it's kind of so government departments they began to see that agenda of affirming every single view, of diversity, that became public policy right across the nation. And to oppose it was to be a bigot. And it comes with all sorts of assumptions which are not challenged. So to challenge it becomes almost impossible because it is seen as the moral ground to have. Otherwise you're some fascist bigot. Whatever you think of Boris Johnson, a lot of people in the Guardian reading press call him a fascist. Well, Boris Johnson is not a fascist. And so we've got this polarisation between people, and you know all about that. I mean, and social media means that the whole of communication between people is speeded up in the world. Things go viral within seconds across the whole world. And people polarise into positions. And it's intensified divisions between people. I think the internet, I do my banking on the internet, on the internet and all, the internet's got enormous benefits, but I think in some ways it's been devastating for the world. When the internet came out in 1997, I think I first used the internet in 1997, who'd have anticipated that within 20 years, it's reckoned that 40% of men have an addiction to pornography online today, who have the internet. Who'd have predicted that? So, this is the thing, isn't it, about sin. It's very helpful as Christians that we recognise that for all good, there's always a bad use. Always, because the human heart is like that. Or think about the addiction of gambling. But these polarisations are colossal. I've got a book about the polarisation of America. And America's more polarised than we are, isn't it? Called Before the Shooting Starts, Preparing for the Next American Civil War. That is not inconceivable that America, because it's loaded with guns and ammunition and all the things that, first time I went to America, this chap said, "Oh, you're sleeping in the basement." So he took me to the basement. There were 12 rifles on the wall. I thought, wow, this is a bit of a different world. And, the place is just loaded with guns. And it's not inconceivable that America might go to war with itself again. And, the world is changing. The influence of China in the future and Russia. I think we are sleepwalking as a nation into the kind of international things we're going to face in the future. Lots of people on the left like the idea of China growing as a superpower because it's a counterweight to America, who they hate, but they should be very careful what they wish for, especially with the track record of China on human rights, which is getting worse and worse and worse at the moment, isn't it? There's evidence at the moment that they are of genocide amongst the Uyghurs. Not just confining them and brainwashing them, but actually murdering them in large numbers, all in the name of some big communist state with a capitalist system. But, if you believe in a communist system, individuals mean nothing. It's like Stalin said, if you want to make an omelette, you've got to break some eggs. These big totalitarian states are willing to break a lot of eggs, and we should be alert to that. Societies where we care for individuals are very rare. Where people have any value or dignity are very rare. And that's come from the gospel, in the end, being made in God's image.
I'm sure there are still some questions.
Yeah.
We do have question and answers after the second session as well. So you can hold on. So let's have a coffee break, and we'll resume about 11:25.